at 12:02. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm Sierra DeCrosta. I'm Israel Policy Forum's Manager of Programs and Partnerships. And I'd like to thank you all for joining this morning for the second installment of our election webinar series, focusing on the role of retired military officers in Israeli politics. I'd also like to thank Rabbi Josh Weinberg and the Union for Reform Judaism for co-sponsoring the series, and Dr. Guy Ziv for sharing his expertise today. Dr. Ziv is an assistant professor in the School of International Service at American University. He's been published in numerous outlets, including Haaretz, The Forward, USA Today, The Hill, and Ynet News. He's been featured as an expert commentator on the BBC, CNN, I-24, Al Jazeera, and many others. Dr. Ziv is the author of the book, Why Hawks Become Doves, Shimon Peres and Foreign Policy Change in Israel, as well as a recent article in the journal Survival, where he examines the views of Israel's retired security officials on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Dr. Ziv actually also used to work at Israel Policy Forum, so welcome back, and we're glad to have you with us today for this briefing. I'll turn it over now to Evan Gottesman, Israel Policy Forum's Associate Director of Policy and Communications, who's going to be moderating today's talk. Just to let you know, the next installment of the series will be on August 6th, and it'll be on the topic of religion and state and how the issue of religion will affect the coming elections with Rabbi Gilad Kariv. Rabbi Kariv is the president and CEO of the Israel Movement for Reform and Progressive Judaism and is a well-known media figure and expert on the issues of religion and state. Evan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Sierra. Thank you again to URJ and Rabbi Weinberg, and of course to Dr. Ziv for joining us. Let's just jump right into it. So we're going to be talking about the retired security establishment in Israel, all these generals who end up in politics, where they stand, how they become such a big phenomenon. And there's really no better time to be talking about this than now. We saw this merger this morning on Israel time of Ehud Barak's Israel Democratic Party and Meretz, which brings in Ehud Barak, of course, former prime minister and a former chief of staff of the army, and Yair Golan, another high-ranking general, into the political landscape and giving them a more realistic chance of entering the Knesset. So, Dr. Ziv, if you could just provide us of an overview, where does the retired security establishment stand on major issues, and how have they become such a big phenomenon in Israeli politics?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me and for the nice introduction and setting up the context, Evan and Sierra. I think before I even mention my my study, just kind of a word on why I came up with this study. I think that there is a genuine fear that we need to acknowledge in Israel and in the diaspora community as well, and among supporters of Israel, that Israel's security needs are real and that the fears are real as well, even if sometimes the perceptions don't necessarily always match the reality. So anybody who's been to Israel in the last decade, maybe longer, who speaks to the average person in Israel will typically hear things like, we gave them everything and we got an intifada. That refers, of course, to the second intifada. Or there is no partner on the other side, quote unquote. That's something that we've heard now for 2 decades. Or more recently, look what happened when we gave up Gaza, referring, of course, to Israel's disengagement from the Gaza Strip. And here, too, in the American Jewish community and among non-Jewish friends of Israel, there are genuine concerns about Israeli security. And I think that it extends to members of this administration, including Jason Greenblatt and David Friedman and Kushner and others who see themselves as strong supporters of Israel. There's also been this, what I consider to be an urban legend, a myth that Netanyahu is Mr. Security. And this is an image that he has very carefully cultivated for himself over many, many years. And that hasn't changed despite many security lapses and failures over the years. And the fact that you have right now a very interesting, very unique phenomenon, which is opposition from the security community. And it comes in different forms. We see, for example, the involvement in various NGOs. Since '88, we've had the Peace and Security Association. It used to be called the Council for Peace and Security, or more recently, the Blue and White Future, and the Commanders for Peace and Security. I believe there's some sort of relationship between IPF and the Commanders. we're talking about hundreds of senior ex-security officials from all of the various security branches and intelligence branches who've essentially teamed up to argue for a two-state solution. And more recently, we've seen an unprecedented involvement in the political arena as well. So the NGOs aside, we have many former IDF chiefs of staff, an unprecedented number, who have teamed up to try to challenge Netanyahu. 3 of them are in the blue and white party or list. And you have, of course, Ehud Barak and former deputy IDF chief Yair Golan, who are in their own separate party. So that's kind of the background behind why I wanted to do the study, to figure out, well, what exactly is the percentage and how many of these former senior security officials are on board with this two-state solution. And so we did a mixed methods design that consisted of nearly 24 interviews with the top IDF brass and former heads of the Mossad and Shin Bet. And also I interviewed former national security advisors, including those who were Netanyahu appointees. And we also did content analysis of newspaper sources. And so we came up with a very extensive database and using quantitative indicators. And what we found was that the vast majority, about 85%, at least 85%, support the two-state solution. And for a number of reasons I can get into, I'm happy to get into, it's a very conservative estimate. So the chances are probably a lot higher that we're talking about closer to 90%, maybe even more than 90% of senior security officials or ex-security officials who are on board with the two-state solution. And so the concern right now, and this is, I would say, marked urgent among many of these officials, is that Netanyahu's policies are leading to this kind of binational nightmare. What some would refer to as a one-state solution. It's not really a solution. And of course, the Palestinians who support a one-state solution have a very different notion of what that one-state solution would look like than those on the national religious right in Israel who supposedly support a one-state solution. We're talking about very different visions here. But what unites the security community, and I would say there's a near consensus here, if not a consensus, is that this one state idea of a binational entity would be the end of the Zionist dream. And so when we look at the reasoning behind support for the two-state solution, what we'll hear is, number one, this is the only way to preserve Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. There is no other way that will do that. And number two, and this was maybe slightly surprising to me when I conducted some of these interviews with security hawks, is that they wanted to end control over Palestinian lives. So this is kind of a moral dimension that I think is often neglected, dismissed, but it came across in many of the interviews, including, by the way, from people who are skeptical of the viability of a Palestinian state. And finally, they believe that Israel would be a more secure, not a less secure state, with a Palestinian state living side by side in peace. And so today, their number one goal is to preserve the two-state solution. I don't think there are any illusions or under any delusion that the negotiations with the Palestinians are about to start tomorrow, with or without the Kushner plan. But I think that they want to do everything possible to keep the two-state solution alive. And that means putting an axe on the legislation that we've seen in the Knesset in the last couple of years, advanced by Ayelet Shaked, Naftali Bennett, and others, who would like to see the annexation of Area C of the West Bank, which comprises roughly 61% of the West Bank, that the security community believes would be the first step towards this binational state that they wish to preserve. I want to also remind the listeners here today that Netanyahu made a pledge 3 days before the April elections that once he's reelected and establishes his new government, he will go ahead with this legislation and implement it. So we're talking about a very dangerous scenario that the security community would like to prevent. So I'll leave it at that and welcome questions.
Great, thank you so much. And that was really informative and lays a good basis for our discussion today. So the way this is going to work for our audience, I'm going to go into a couple of questions to lead off. And after that point, we'll also turn it over to the audience for question and answer, and I'll give more instructions further down the line as to how you can issue your questions for Dr. Ziv. But just starting off, you mentioned that generals, retired security officials, believe that two states is something that will ultimately make Israel more secure. And of course, that's a belief that we share at Israel Policy Forum. But at the same time, we have to be upfront and acknowledge that there's fading enthusiasm for two states, or at least complacency with the status quo of creeping annexation among many in the Israeli public. So what are the obstacles to the security community, especially the people running in the elections, being able to convey their message effectively to the public?
Well, the key obstacle here, and I think you kind of hinted at it, is the zeitgeist of the times. That the word occupation, by the way, hasn't even been used in God knows how long. I think Sharon and Olmert were the last prime ministers to even utter those words. We don't hear from Netanyahu. We haven't heard it from Netanyahu, even around the Bar Ilan speech time of June 2009. So nobody today is really talking about it. And I think that one of the ways that we see a lot of the politicians from the security community trying to deal with this or address it is to use code words, such as separation from the Palestinians, divorce from the Palestinians, ways that they believe are more palatable to the public, or in some cases avoid this issue altogether. And this is kind of frustrating to some of us who are watching these guys in blue and white, thinking this is an opportunity. You have 3 former IDF chiefs of staff who presumably know more about security than the average person, and certainly the average politician. There are other generals, by the way, in that list, so they're not the only ones. And yet they've teamed up, and they say very little about security. And so I think that it's kind of an ongoing missed opportunity. And I think Barak realized that there's a vacuum here, entered the political fray, or re-entered the political fray, and brought with him Yair Golan, who's not afraid to say the things that I think the blue and white team knows is the case. So the question is, how do you sell it? How do you market this? How do you reintroduce this idea to the Israeli public, which has just tuned out of this for a long time? The other kind of point I think needs to be made here is that there's been no effective opposition in Israel for many years. And so the only real opposition you hear on this front is from NGOs. And the human rights organizations have very little clout in Israel. They've been delegitimized by the Netanyahu government. Some of them are in the process of being outlawed. And so then you're left with the security community. And they've essentially been the de facto opposition to this creeping annexation that I've referred to in my briefing.
So given that, and with all of the obstacles that are stacked up against the retired security officials who are running for election, how effective can they be? Because we've seen a lot of parties sort of just tack on generals that may or may not have so much name recognition. For example, in the last election, you had Labor bring in Tal Russo as their number 2, and just as quickly as Labor had its worst showing ever, Russo resigns after the election. So is it just by itself that people will respect them because these people are generals, or do they have to have held a certain rank or have a certain level of name recognition or fame? What makes them effective?
Well, I think the message is what would make them effective. I think gone are the days where you have former generals like Moshe Dayan who are seen as heroes. I think those days are over. And at this point, what the strength that they bring is in numbers. And if they have a unifying, coherent message and don't try to blur the lines between Netanyahu and where they stand on security issues, which is exactly what I'm accusing the blue and white list of having done, I think that you will have maybe not this in the September, maybe not in time for the September election, but you will have in the next year or so kind of momentum to revisit this issue. I mean, if you look at the list that Ehud Barak put together, they're emphasizing this issue. And now with the Meretz unity deal that just happened today, hours ago, they're virtually assured to be inside the next Knesset. And so you're going to have advocates for this issue. And I think that the blue and white team, once they're in action, hopefully will follow suit and talk about the things that they talked about before they became politicians. And even, by the way, Bogi Ya'alon, who is kind of the opponent of a two-state solution in that blue and white list, he understands the dangers of a one-state reality as much as anybody else, and wrote an interesting piece on that in Foreign Affairs a few years ago, challenging the right-wing annexation plan. So he's on board as well. And I think that if they talk about it, which they haven't done yet, I think that you will see a shift in the discourse, and that shift needs to take place.
So you bring up Bogi Ya'alon, who raises an interesting element of this conversation, because as you hinted at, even though Ya'alon is opposed to maybe annexation, he's also a very public opponent of two states. He reiterated that after he joined Kachol Lavan in the lead up to the last election. That's been his position for a while. In your study that you published in Survival, you identified that there were about 11% of retired security officials who oppose two states, like Ya'alon. So I guess I have a two-part question. First, where is Ya'alon on this? Because as you mentioned, he opposes annexation, but he also opposes two states. And how does he fit into this puzzle? And then for the larger group of this 11% who are opposed to two states, what explains their outlier views? Is there anything that you could identify across the board of that minority who were supporting, or rather who were not supporting two states from the retired security community?
All right, so first, just very briefly on Ya'alon, I don't know if Ya'alon has a very coherent answer to this question. And I've interviewed Ya'alon, by the way. And so he opposes a two-state solution, I think, because he's skeptical that it would be viable, for the same reason that others would oppose a two-state solution. But he's not on board the one-state solution. He does not want to see a binational state. I think he's more on the autonomy plan. But I spoke to other generals and asked them about him. And they are confident that if he were prime minister, I don't think he's going to be prime minister at any time in the near future, but if he were prime minister, he would see the same things that other prime ministers have seen and draw similar conclusions. So they're not even worried about Ya'alon and his skepticism of a two-state solution. And as I said, he's very much opposed to a one-state solution or a binational state. So I think we're dealing with nuances here. But more to your question on the 11% that we coded as not supporting the two-state solution. I want to clarify a couple things here. Number one is we adhered to a very strict coding rule when we were doing the coding for our data set. And we were so strict, just to give you an example, that Ron Ben Barak, who is the former deputy Mossad chief who is with Yair Lapid in his list and a member of Knesset, part of that blue and white list, we coded him as opposing a two-state solution, or sorry, not opposing it, but as inconclusive. He was in our inconclusive column because he did not explicitly endorse a two-state solution in the data set that we came up with. However, we happen to know, because we've done our homework and you can Google it and find it, that he is supporting a two-state solution. But we wanted to be very conservative about how we were coding these officials. And so when they didn't explicitly endorse two-state solution, we didn't even code them as supporting it. But he's an example of somebody who does support it. Also, some of the guys who are in Likud now from the security community, and there are two prominent ones. There's Avi Dichter, the former Shin Bet chief, and there's Yoav Gallant, formerly from Kulanu, who was a high-ranking general. He was very close to becoming the chief of staff. So they're both in Likud now. Before they joined Netanyahu, they were on record supporting a two-state solution, and now they're quiet about it. So there's really a consensus here, very few who oppose it. Now, among the 11% that oppose it or that we can't conclude support it, only a minuscule percentage of those 11%, only a tiny minority would support a binational state. Like, for example, Gershon HaKohen, former Major General Gershon HaKohen. He is a religious right-wing ideologue who supports annexation and the kind of rights vision of a one-state solution, but he is a rare exception to the rule. The other ones, I think, are just skeptical that there is a partner on the other side, that a Palestinian state would be viable, but they are not necessarily firmly opposed to a two-state solution. Just one more comment I want to make on that front, which is many of the interviewees told us that those who aspire to join the political arena are very cautious about endorsing a two-state solution publicly because it would be seen as a political risk. And so they've kind of avoided discussing it altogether. You take a look at Gabi Ashkenazi and Benny Gantz, for example. They're not talking about it. They haven't talked about it since they've decided to run. But we know that they support a two-state solution, but they're not talking about it. And so that goes to your earlier question about how do you change the situation? Well, you got to start talking about it if you're going to change the discourse, but they're afraid of losing support from kind of the soft right or from the mainstream public. But it's a very tiny percentage of these security members, officials, who support a one-state solution. Almost all of them are on board with some version of a two-state solution.
Just zeroing in again, though, on the opponents or soft opponents, people who have sort of backtracked or become quiet about their previous positions. You mentioned Yoav Gallant and Avi Dichter. How does the right leverage their security officials who run with them? Because we know how it works on the center left, that they are really upfront and pushing the security bona fides of their members of their parties. Benjamin Netanyahu, who does not have a long or distinguished military career compared to some of these other more high-ranking officers, has built his whole personal brand around being identified as Mr. Security, what you would describe as an urban legend. So do they even see a need to have people like Dichter and Gallant, or are they just an add-on? Where do they fit into the right?
They'll add them on when they can add them on, but I would say that it's more a case of political opportunism in Dichter's case, and certainly in Gallant's case, because they don't subscribe to Likud's worldview. They just wanted to have it. They wanted to be in power. They wanted to have influence. They wanted to be ministers. But we know their views, because their views are very public. You don't have to do a lot of digging to figure out what their views are. But they're quiet once they join Likud. I think that Netanyahu has a lot of deserves a lot of credit or blame, depending on your views on Netanyahu, for essentially sidelining the generals, sidelining members of the security community, and he has very effectively done so by delegitimizing his critics and referring to them as leftists. And so this has been part of an ongoing delegitimization process in Israel for a couple of decades. He is not the only guilty party here. Yair Lapid himself has tried to double down on this delegitimizing the left in the hopes of getting some right-wing voters. He hasn't been very successful in doing that, but he hasn't given up. And so a lot of the security officials whose views would otherwise have been taken very seriously are seen as quote-unquote leftists, and therefore their views are no longer relevant. And that's why Benny Gantz and Ashkenazi are studiously avoiding this label by avoiding discussing this issue.
How seriously do people take Netanyahu's claims of generals being leftists? Because it seems, at least from my vantage, that he's almost emptied the term of any meaning, because any of his opponents, not just the generals, automatically become a leftist. I mean, we've seen in this last cycle, in the lead up to the September election, Netanyahu has now awarded Avigdor Lieberman the label of leftist. And you can call Lieberman a lot of things, but he's certainly not a leftist. I don't think that applies to him. So do people really buy into it? Does it make them reluctant? What's the reaction when they hear Netanyahu applying this to former security establishment people?
I think that it works very well with a base. And just as President Trump has figured out how to maintain his base, I think Netanyahu figured that out even earlier. And he knows a thing or two about politics and winning elections. And if it weren't effective, I guarantee you he wouldn't be doing this. So it is working. And, you know, some of us who follow Israeli politics closely, you and I might be rolling our eyes and say, well, Lieberman is now a leftist, but it does work. It's working, or it's worked until now, put it to you that way. I don't know if it'll work in September, but it's worked up until now, including the last April, elections. It's worked. And so he's done that very effectively with the generals. I think that the interesting thing about Barak and Yair Golan is that they're saying, okay, so we're leftists. This is the first time that we see security officials in politics who are not afraid of that label and are actually embracing it. We'll see how that goes.
Now, does the effectiveness of this play in at all to what you were talking about the lack of national heroes or people with kind of national appeal like Moshe Dayan? I would throw in Yitzhak Rabin, people who were part of the formative years of the state in the early wars. The fact that, like, you're calling a general leftist who people might not recognize their name anyways, or they're not someone who's a national celebrity in the same way that some of these earlier generals were.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that, look, it's part of a natural maturation of society. One can say it's a healthy development, that you're not holding up a general to a heroic status. And it's a natural development. I mean, Israel is no longer a baby. It's 71, years old. So it's still relatively young, but it's not a new nation anymore. And it's a safe country. I mean, there's no longer the situation where Israelis feel that they're about to be eliminated. So you have a regional superpower that today almost takes it for granted that it's a regional superpower, and therefore is not going to hold up these figures in the same limelight as past generations would have done.
And one more point about the right's reaction to generals and trying to hold them back or prevent them from being an effective opposition. You wrote about in your recent study the Chalutz law, or the cooling off period for generals, that it was extended. Previously, they had, I believe, 6 months from when they retired from the military to when they could enter politics, and now that's been extended to several years.
Yeah.
So was this deliberate, done with the idea of preventing a center-left opposition from retired military officers in mind? Where did that come from?
Of course, it came directly from Netanyahu, who directed his allies in Likud to sponsor this legislation, because at that point in time, Dan Chalutz was seen as kind of the next big political, former IDF chief of staff who's going to join politics and possibly challenge the future prime minister Netanyahu. And so it was done intentionally to prevent that, because 6-month cooling off period is very different than 3-year cooling off period. And now they're getting older. They're getting older in the army. They're retiring at an older age. And so 3 years makes a big difference, and there's a loss of momentum. Nobody remembers, you won't necessarily remember the people who were IDF chiefs 3 years ago as opposed to 6 months ago. And so the idea was absolutely to stymie future IDF chiefs from challenging him. And ironically, now he's got 4 IDF chiefs who are challenging Netanyahu. That's the irony here, despite that legislation.
I just want to make a quick note before I move into my next question that we want to move in soon into audience questions. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box. So you can type questions into there, and we'll be taking questions for Dr. Ziv from there. So you can start submitting those, and we'll keep an eye out towards them and bringing them up shortly. Just following off of that, so that was really, Netanyahu has been aware of this for a while though, because this was something that he was preempting before he was even prime minister, because this law was passed in 2007 or 2006.
Correct, 2007.
Yeah. So, so is this something? Where does his fear of the generals stem from?
Well, I mean, who else is going to oppose him? You have he's been able to essentially help destroy the left-wing opposition with a lot of help, you can say, from Barak and others who did a lot of damage over the years to the Israeli left. But you essentially had no political opposition all these years. He's been blessed, in a sense, by having very little opposition. In fact, the only opposition he's really had in the last decade has come from the right, not from the left, whether it's Lieberman or Naftali Bennett or Ayelet Shaked or others on the right. So he's had no fear of the left. So the only real fear that he had internally, politically, I'm not including Obama and others in the international community, is from the security community, because he knows that that's how he was defeated essentially by Barak in '99. And he did not want a repeat of that. And so he's always viewed them with suspicion. He left them out of the peace process when he became prime minister, even the first time around. They had always questioned his judgment from day one. And so he's always kind of seen them as potential political opponents.
Interesting. So that covers pretty well the right-wing opposition to the generals. You mentioned before the idea of Israel's maturation as a more developed country and having a more developed political culture, and this idea that people don't need to idolize generals who have won the early wars anymore. Is there any discomfort on the left with the generals, both as the idea of so many military officers entering politics, or the way that they talk about two states, or the way they don't talk about it sometimes? How are they perceived from that sector?
There's a tremendous discomfort. I mean, that's an understatement in the left. If you would have told me a couple months ago that Barak and Meretz are going to team up, I would have thought that, I would have asked you what you were smoking, because it was just such an unrealistic scenario. Barak's vision, and not vision, but his approach is very different than the approach of, say, Moshe Raz or Zahava Galon or others in the Meretz party, Asawi Frij, and deep discomfort among the left and among Arabs, I would say, too. But there's also reality, and the reality is that when we talk about the left in Israel, we're talking about a very small percentage of the population. And so how can you have an influence when you have very few votes, when you're on the cusp of not even crossing the threshold? And so this was really a kind of a reality check when we looked at the polls and saw that there's a real chance that Barak is not going to enter, that Meretz is not going to enter, Labor hasn't done well at all. And so this is really kind of something that they're going to have to deal with. And I'm not under any delusion that it's going to be a happy marriage. I'm not sure what's going to happen once they get in, assuming they get in, when they start disagreeing over not even the issues, but the rhetoric in terms of how they approach it. I think the left, for example, has a very big problem with terms like divorcing from the Palestinians, separating from the Palestinians. Where's the idea of coexistence? Where's the term occupation here? So there's definitely a lot of discomfort, I think, on the left, especially among human rights advocates, because at the end of the day, these security guys speak a different language.
And so they seem to fit in a little awkwardly into Israeli politics. They don't really have a place on the right, and they're kind of a necessity for the left, but people aren't super comfortable with them. So do you see them as like a temporary phenomenon in Israeli politics, if, and we're talking big ifs here, but if there were some kind of agreement down the line, do you see the generals as sort of fading away before then, or Are they there only as like sort of a temporary salve to bring Israel closer to an arrangement, or as a stopgap against the slide towards one state?
Well, I can't speak to individual politicians because I have no idea who's going to, be there in the long term and who's not. What I can tell you is if you look at the arc of Israeli history, you will always see from day one members of the security establishment who go into politics. That's not really a brand new phenomenon. I think what is new or different today is that you have an unprecedented number of these senior officials who have both joined NGOs like the Commanders for Israeli Security and are signing petitions and writing letters and signing on to ads, and an unprecedented number of them who are entering the political arena, some of them with no political experience and no idea how to do politics. And I think that that's what we need to look at. Why is this phenomenon happening? And the answer is, I think they're trying to say, even if some of them are not saying it explicitly, that Israel is in danger of losing its Jewish and democratic identity. We're here to save it. We're here to preserve the two-state solution.
And the key, actually, before I move into this question again, I want to remind our audience that you can submit questions through the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions for Dr. Ziv, you can type them there and we'll put them forward. There's also the chat box on the bottom right. You can open up and submit your questions that way. Okay, so there's this idea of these NGOs that you mentioned, the generals organizations, the Council of Peace and Security, before more recently Commanders for Israel Security, who, as you mentioned, are Israel Policy Forum's partners in Israel. What ways do they bring their messages to the public? Because they're operating sort of in a different realm of politics from people who are running for election, like Yair Golan, Ehud Barak, the guys from Kachol Lavan. Where do they fit in?
I mean, I think you'd also be able to have some insight here because your organization is partnering with them. But I mean, I think they've tried to make they've tried to influence the public discourse by raising awareness with their letters and their ads and the billboards and the petitions. And they had a few press conferences earlier on. I don't know the extent to which they've had influence so far. I'm really not sure. But they've been more active. And even some of the people, though, who haven't officially signed on to the Commanders, for example, a couple of the recent former Mossad and Shin Bet chiefs are not members of the Commanders, but they on their own are giving interviews and writing op-eds talking about the same thing. And so I think what we need to figure out is how do the politicians on the kind of center left of the political map, how do they capitalize on this? So far, they haven't been able to do so effectively because, as I said, the mainstream have ignored and avoided this issue. But if the blue and white team especially is able to capitalize on this by discussing these issues, and perhaps they're waiting to do so until after the elections, which is probably my best guess, then I think you can have a real change, because the change has to happen internally. It can't. It has to happen politically. It can't just happen from the outside. As much as I love seeing, grassroots activism and NGOs and a vibrant civil society, it's great. It's important, but it's not going to do the trick. It'll only happen once the politicians and those that are perceived as mainstream politicians are talking about these issues and doing so in a clear way.
So we have a question from the audience about the gatekeepers phenomenon. This film that came out a couple of years ago, the former heads of the Shin Bet saying that there's no military solution to the conflict. How was that received? Because that was made a big splash in the United States. I remember when it came out, it was a big deal in the American Jewish community. How did it play out in Israel?
Well, I think that's the problem. It played out very well here in the American community, but in Israel, it it didn't really have a tremendous amount of influence. What did have a certain amount of influence, though, is that before the gatekeepers came out, a lot of people don't know this, but there was an interview in Yediot Achronot, which was at that point, during the Sharon era, the #1 paper in Israel. For many years, it was the #1 paper before Israel Hayom came to the scene. And they interviewed 4 of the 6 Shin Bet heads. And Sharon, who was prime minister at the time, reportedly it had a very big impact on him. I think the interview was around 2003. And so he took their criticisms into consideration and then gave speeches in which he talked about not just the disengagement plan, but the idea that this is not the kind of the end of the process, this is the beginning of the process, and we're going to lead to a political solution here, which was exactly their criticism. So it's not enough to have a film or to have an interview, but I think that kind of started the ball rolling in a sense. And it's interesting because all 6 former Shin Bet chiefs, all living Shin Bet chiefs, and all 6 living former Mossad chiefs agree that the 2-state solution is the way to go. All of them.
We have a question from Reuven asking about women in the security establishment. We've heard a lot about these generals who are all men who have entered politics. Are there, and we know that there are very accomplished women in the security establishment in Israel. Have any of them entered electoral politics? What's their role, and how do they play with Israeli voters?
I mean, we know that it's a extremely male-dominated field. So we're talking about a tiny percentage of women who are even, generals, I would say. There are some. Yair Lapid actually brought in Orna Abravanel, who is on the list and is a Knesset member. I think she's pretty high up there. I don't remember the ranking or the number there, but she's an ex-general. There are a few other ex-generals who, female ex-generals, no Mossad or Shin Bet chiefs, but high-ranking female officers who are on the list, but they're a very small minority. Sorry, I'm not hearing you, Evan.
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. So we have another question regarding the tactics that the military has employed, and I'll just paraphrase a little, that the Israeli military has undertaken some more heavy-handed tactics in the past, including when at the direction of some of these generals who have ultimately taken office or while they were in office as prime minister, for example, Rabin and Sharon. How does that square with their political beliefs and the policies that they undertake once they're in office? And you could also bring up Benny Gantz's sort of bragging about how many terrorists he killed in Gaza when he was at the head of the army in his inaugural campaign ad during the last election cycle.
Well, I can't really speak about military tactics here. I don't think that's the question either. I think the question is what happens once they enter the political arena. And I think that's really the important question here. And what we see in Israel, at least, is a greater sense of responsibility. A lot of these high-ranking security officials, especially from the army, have seen things that most of us haven't seen and witnessed things that most of us haven't witnessed. And they understand the costs of war, and they're not eager for Israel to enter into another war, and they're not eager for the occupation to continue indefinitely either, which is why I think many of them that enter politics are seen as kind of more dovish, even though that's an interesting term to use for a general who's had blood on his hands. But that's what happens once they enter the political arena. Even with somebody like Sharon, who had a terribly, bloody record, if you want to call it that, as a colonel early on in the 50s, and then later as a general, somebody who the Kahan Commission determined could no longer serve as defense minister, let alone prime minister, but defense minister because of the indirect role he played in the Sabra and Shatila massacre in Lebanon. So fast forward years later, Sharon is prime minister and is asked, how could you, of all people, the father of the settlements, the person who said that Gaza is just as important to you as Tel Aviv, how could you do this? And his response was, because there are things I see from here that I couldn't see from over there. And what's interesting from my own interviews and study is that some of the generals who have been closest to the Palestinian issue, in other words, those who serve in the civil administration, are the ones that are the most critical of the Israeli occupation and want to see it end. And so I'm not at all surprised that once they join the political arena, they tend to kind of moderate their rhetoric and have different policies than we see from the secular the civilian politicians.
Now we have a question from Bob Lifton, who I believe is coming in via audio. Bob, you'd wanted to ask a question?
In this whole situation, our last speaker, when they talked about the issues that were of importance to Israelis, security was very high up, and the last issue was the Palestinian issue. So apparently the Israelis don't connect the Palestinian issue to security, which is why it seems to me that the generals who stand for security don't loom large in their eyes. It seems to me the issue is that we have not been able to connect in the Israeli eyes the issue of security and the Palestinian issue together. And the Palestinians is something they disregard altogether. I think it was 7%, if you recall the last speaker we had. Only 7% of Israelis saw it as an important issue.
So I guess how would we address the lack of priority that's placed by the Israeli public on the Palestinian issue?
Yeah, how can we identify it in their eyes as a security issue?
Correct.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with that sentiment, and I think that's why I began by talking about how security is something that needs to be addressed because it's a real concern, it's a legitimate concern, and whether or not we agree with the perceptions that people have about what Israel had done in the past and what it had led to, these are concerns that need to be addressed. And I think that it's for the politicians really to address that question, and they need to do a much better job of connecting the peace process with the security process. Call it the security process. Change the language, do what you need to do, but you need to make that connection that has not been made.
We have another question which raises an interesting point about how generals are perceived, about the way generals are perceived based on their attitudes or behaviors to the average soldier. Moshe Ya'alon, who we've talked a lot about, took a lot of flack from the right because of what happened with the Elor Azaria trial, for example. Elor Azaria, the soldier who shot and immobilized a Palestinian combatant in Hebron and killed him against orders, sent to jail, and Ya'alon supported the way that was handled and took a lot of flack for the way the right framed it, throwing an ordinary soldier under the bus. Does this play into the way these generals turned politicians are perceived?
Yes, because the other phenomenon that we haven't discussed today yet is the populist phenomenon. And, populism has been something that isn't unique to Israel these days. We see it all over the world. But in Israel, it's actually been around longer than it has been in this country or in the UK. And so when we had that trial of the soldier who killed an unarmed Palestinian several years ago, the populist politicians like Lieberman exploited this and jumped on board to turn the public's wrath and anger against the IDF. How could you, the IDF who's sending these soldiers, not support them at the end? Because the IDF has strict rules of conduct, strict codes of conduct. And so Netanyahu tried to kind of have it both ways. On the one hand, he didn't jump on board in condemning the IDF, but at the same time, he allowed his colleagues on the right to do so. And he also called Elor Azaria's parents and offered his condolences. And so he is, really complicit with this kind of atmosphere that we've seen the last few years. And to Ya'alon's credit, Ya'alon defended the IDF and the IDF's handling of the situation, as did, by the way, Yair Golan, who made his own controversial comments around that same time period and has defended his statements since then. And so you have this populist phenomenon, but you also have, and I think this needs to be acknowledged, kind of an anti-populist phenomenon, a backlash. People like Yair Golan and Moshe Ya'alon from the security establishment who are trying to fight this very dangerous phenomenon in Israel.
Right, and we should also add to that Gadi Eisenkot, and all these guys took very severe vitriol for the way that they stood with the process. I mean, there were protesters outside of the military court chanting "Rabin needs a friend" towards Eisenkot, with the implications that come with that. Yeah, that's something that's definitely a big issue, and it's important that we raised it. We have one more question, and then we're going to have to move along, about the way the pro-annexation camp reacts to the security officials. We've talked about the right broadly, and obviously there's a spectrum. We've talked about people who are kind of soft right-wingers, are just kind of quiet on their views. There's also a more and more active, more and more energized annexation movement that really actively wants to absorb the territories and move towards a one-state outcome. How do they respond to the security officials?
They're fighting it. They're fighting it tooth and nail, and they see it as a threat to their vision. And it's a very, they have a messianic vision of a greater Israel and a Jewish religion. It's kind of a theocracy in a sense, or a version of theocracy. Of course, there are differences among them, so I don't want to lump them all together. But what they have in common is this push towards a Jewish state over the democratic state. To them, if you're forcing them to choose between a democracy and a Jewish state, they'll easily take the Jewish state and they'll forego democracy. And if you want to call it apartheid, they'll embrace apartheid. That's fine with them. That's okay with them. And that's really the phenomenon that these members of the security community are fighting against. One of my interviewees was a former religious, he's still religious, but he's a former national security advisor to Netanyahu, who is not on board the two-state solution and was not coded as, in our study as supporting a two-state solution. But when I pushed him on that topic, when I said, well, what else do you, what is your solution then? What else do you want to see happen? Do you want to see a one state? He said, no. And at the end, he basically said, if you're forcing me to choose if I want enemies, internal enemies or external enemies, which is how he defined it, that was his term, not mine, I'd rather have external enemies. And so kind of in a very roundabout way, said that he would live with a two-state solution and understands that that needs to happen. And after that interview, not long after that interview, he wrote a piece in which he talked about stopping to build the settlement blocks. So he kind of criticized without criticizing, in a very subtle way, criticized the Netanyahu government's support of building outside of the major settlement blocks, because they all know the same thing, which is that's leading to an apartheid regime that they all want to prevent.
So on that very sobering note, unfortunately, we're going to have to move on from questions. If you're looking for more content like this, more elections, webinars, videos, analysis, podcasts, we've had 2 Israel Policy Pod episodes in just this 1 week, then I would encourage you all to check out Israel Policy Forum's 120 project. for more elections resources at www.israelpolicyforum.org/elections2. That's number 2. And now I would like to hand it over to Rabbi Josh Weinberg from the URJ.
Well, thanks. I really want to thank Dr. Guy Ziv and Evan Gottesman for this really fascinating conversation as we look at the trends that are changing in Israeli politics, and we look at the different characters and players, and of course, the role of the military that has, as Dr. Ziv just taught us, played such an incredibly impactful role, and to see how that's changing. And I'm sure we'll be watching to see who gets finally slated in what role as the deadline of August 1st approaches, when all parties have to file their slates. And we hope that you will then join us for continued expert analysis as we follow closely the weeks and days leading up to the Israeli elections. Of course, on August 6th, we'll be pivoting topics and talking about the role of religion leading up to the elections, as there have been many, many debates about religion and state and some of those issues, especially with the issue of religion playing a major role in why we're having elections at all this coming September. I want to thank IPF for their partnership and for pushing this series far and wide, as are we. And we ask you to share this with your communities and your congregations and your friends and family, and of course on your networks. And we look forward to the next time. So many thanks and shalom. Oh, we will remind everyone, in addition to August 6th, to save the date of August 22nd as well. As they say, same bat time, same bat channel. And we look forward to being with you when we can discuss the role of the Arab parties running for the Knesset.
Great. Thank you again to URJ and to you and to Dr. Ziv. And we hope we'll see you all on August 6th and August 22nd as we continue this series.